Hello. Yep. Seriously? I'm glad that you showed up today. We know at 2:45 that statements were made and comments were released, and that seems to be the last thing in this process, at least for this moment, is the exchange of money and the land back. And I think that I would imagine that people want to get that done quickly and part company. It's great that you all showed up instead. This evening, our panelists have spent their lives in these and related and adjacent fields. They have expertise in the issues that they're speaking of. And as a community, Muncie, Delaware County, we want to go on record that we held an informational forum, an educational forum on the impacts of this particular type of industry, as well as hazardous materials industries, and the impact that they have on environment and society. And so it brings a little bit of resolution. I thought the timing was interesting, that approximately 4 hours before this information is shared tonight was when they selected to back out, and I'm really thankful that they did. Our speakers tonight, Our speakers are neighbors and from Indiana. They work and live and practice their fields here, do their advocacy work here. And I do want to mention that the outpouring of support for this issue was off the hook. I've heard this like little proverb going around from a variety of places. I did not start it, but it is something to the effect of, we've known that our money has been squandered for some years, but we drew the line, when it came to our brains and our nervous systems and our children and our air and our water and our soil. Everybody rose up in one. Everybody rose up in unity. And I think that this momentum, it does not matter what party you are a part of. But that this momentum will carry on. I don't think this is a flash in the pan. The people, what we've learned is that we can form small groups all over the county that work on particular issues, share that information, and appropriately influence our decision makers. And maybe we thought we couldn't do that before. Maybe we thought it wouldn't matter, but we know differently now. So thank you to everyone who's been working 18-hour days for the last 3 weeks. Our speakers tonight will give their presentations in their areas, and you have note cards that when you have a question, write it on the note card, raise your hand, hold it up, and someone will come get it. And then they'll be sorted through, and then at the end of all the presentations, those questions will be passed up here. Everybody have note cards that wants one? Very good. Our first speaker is Dr. Rybarczyk. He is a professor, a chemist, and a concerned community member.
Thank you very much for doing this. Thank you for everything all of you have done. I've been doing this for many, many years, since I've been here in Muncie. I've never seen an outpouring such as this. You are amazing. You are the heroes of Muncie to do what you have done. Now, there was a meeting scheduled for August 20th by Mr. Morrison, and unlike Mr. Morrison, I did not withdraw from this meeting. I did not cancel this meeting. I showed up. Yeah. So did you. So since he can't be here to answer questions, I thought I would bring something to represent him to answer the questions. Because absolutely any contact with the community was avoided. And the misrepresentations and the inaccuracies that everyone in this room has been accused of were turned around and put on there. Now, I was asked to speak and kind of do an overview, but in light of what has happened, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give the other experts a better opportunity to present a lot of data. In preparing for today, I have 59 PowerPoint slides showing all the inaccurate data. There is that much of it. I don't want to bore you with all that. It's a moot point at this point, but it's there and it's available. All the inaccuracies, all the fibbing, we'll just say, that went on in this case, and we were never allowed to confront the officials or the company itself, and that is a tragedy. So the first thing I want to do before I say any more, and I'm not going to do very much, is to apologize to all of you, and both personally and professionally. This is not how science is done. It's a disgrace how this has been handled. Never should have happened. And I guess what I'm here to say tonight is please stay vigilant. Please keep educating. That's what I do, is to be an educator, to get rid of scientific innocence, to get rid of scientific ignorance. All you have to do is ask. We stumbled upon this on June 27th when I was contacted by a city official asking me to look at the permit, to review the permit. I hadn't looked at it until then, and so this person who I knew and trusted, I looked at the permit, and in about an hour and a half, I came up with almost 200 things wrong with the permit. And I contacted IDEM, and I sent them a bunch of those, and Ms. Frank can talk about some of the things she's interacted with IDEM also. And by chance, this individual told me that there was going to be a public meeting with the company on July 1st. So we had 3 days to get some people together and get them technical questions to ask. And we showed up at this meeting where maybe there were 30 or 40 people. And after the dog and pony show was over, we were able to ask questions, and we fired one question after another, which, unlike what the paper put in, they were not able to answer. And all they kept saying was, it's to be determined, to be determined. And then from that time, later in the day at City Council, they passed the ordinance to approve the $15 million. And what I was going to go through were all the untruths that were said. One of the things that I do, I just lectured today for the first time at Ball State, and one of my first slides is, data speaks the truth. Learn to read its message. This happened because of data. There's no fibbing, there's no inaccuracies, it's data. It either is or it isn't. And I think that's one of the reasons this got stopped today, was because they couldn't come up with the data that they promised. They should have been supplying data from day one. They had 4 facilities across the world that have been running up to 10 years. And Mr. Morrison said they had to take time and cancel the meeting because they couldn't come up with their own data. And that's because they were caught with no data. One of my other slides I taught my students this morning was, there's 2 things a scientist never, ever says. And I know you all got to see the paper. One of them is, you never tell somebody there's 0 emissions. No such thing. Because when you do, You didn't check zero. We cannot see one atom or one molecule. It will be below our detection limits, but we can't say there's none, because the minute you say there's none, you get caught not telling the truth. And that's exactly what happened. At least on 6 instances, the leaders who made the decisions were told that there would be zero emissions from this site. There aren't zero. You all, this has not been out there, so I'll just tell you a few of the things I was going to say. This was going to emit, and you're all really conscious about global warming and so on, and you hear about greenhouse gases and CO2. This facility would have emitted 418,000 tons of CO2 to the air. And yet, the statements were made, there would be zero emissions. That's how far off this was. I want to show you the first slide I was going to show tonight on the PowerPoints. And my comment on the slide is, how, to all the officials here that voted for this and so on, how does this promote the health, welfare, and safety of the citizens of Delaware County? This is what the workers at the facility in Alabama have to wear. How is this healthy for any human being? This is what was approved. So I'm not going to take the time to show you all the things I had. Again, 59 slides. I'm not going to bore you. I will let the actual experts talk a lot about this. You should be extremely proud of what has been accomplished here. Again, in all the years I've done this, other than in Henry County, I have never seen this type of turnout, this amount of interest, this amount of research. This is phenomenal what you have accomplished. I sent Mayor Tyler a message about a week ago, and I told him, I've never been more proud of the citizens of Delaware County. Thank you for what you have done. If this has saved one child from becoming ill or getting cancer like the people in Franklin, if this has brought in one good business with good jobs, then it has been a success and well worth the effort. Thank you all for what you have done.
Dr. Rybarczyk, where might those 59 slides be accessible?
The next time we have to fight this battle.
Okay, all right.
It's specific for this one. I can always help somebody else and read the permits and figure it all out.
Okay.
The other thing is, since I'm not speaking, if you do have any questions, please write them on the cards. I will answer any questions at the end that you ask.
Thank you. Our next presenter or panelist is Dr. John H. West. He's the Assistant Professor of Urban Planning at Ball State University.
Did you have slides? I did. Yeah, I'll figure it out.
It won't work.
All right. Welcome. I wanted to introduce myself. Again, I'm Dr. John West. I am an urban planning professor. I've been at Ball State for 4 years. Before that, I got my PhD in urban planning. And my area of expertise is on governance, which is how formal government and citizens groups work together in order to make cities work well. And I would say, first of all, to the organizers of this, congratulations on your success. Congratulations on producing information that's useful to the public and stopping a proposal that was potentially harmful. And I would also say that our work has just begun. The system of public governance for development in Muncie does not work the way that it ought to. And I say this as a person who has worked closely with the city. Many people in the city I respect and rely on, but there is something wrong here. And these are problems that need to be addressed systematically. So I'm going to make 3 points. The first one is kind of a foregone conclusion. The Waelz Sustainable Products plant was a flawed plan. Our private and public economic development process systematically failed at identifying these flaws. And successful economic development, successful development of any sort, requires the kinds of public participation and expertise that's been on demonstration for the past couple of weeks. And so the WSP plant, as we all now know, was not a good location for its use. It's a polluting industry downwind of a large population center. The report that they submitted to IDEM concluded, or they proposed that they would emit up to 1,540 pounds of airborne mercury, and that is, in fact, the highest amount of airborne mercury of any plant in the United States. 1,260 pounds of airborne lead, which is the highest in Muncie over Exide, which is its own problematic site. Is near public facilities, neighborhoods, and public facilities and neighborhoods, so it's near within 3 miles of Ball State, IU Health, St. Mary's Elementary, Burris Laboratory School, Northside Middle School, Westview Elementary School, Southview Elementary School, all the Yorktown schools. It's within 3 miles of all these sites. It's right across the street from the Youth Opportunity Center where there are kids, living, and it's near our wastewater treatment and White River, where we and people downriver get our drinking water. And so I compared this to 9 facilities that emit similar levels of lead or of mercury, and this location is inappropriate because we have a much larger population than most other similar facilities. We have an average, so of the 9 facilities, they have an average of about 7,500 residents. We have a population of 68,529, according to the American Community Survey. And so given that we've decided that this is not a good use of our tax money, I just want to remind us of how we got here. The city, the county, and the economic development organization and Muncie Redevelopment Commission communicated about this plan. This was a plan that the Chamber of Commerce held a public forum for and supported. And this is this proposal. There were 2 public meetings in City Hall, both of which were difficult to understand exactly what was going to be addressed during the public meetings. The City Council passed an ordinance to provide $15 million of public support, and that was unanimously voted on, unanimously. Finally, as a result of this organizing, the MRC and City of Muncie indicated that they came up with a solution to buy the property and not go forth with this project. And again, so this is a systemic problem. This is not, there was no outside expert health, environment, or urban planning input prior to the subsidy being awarded. The City Council didn't really have the information that they needed to make a proper decision. The IDEM permit was not circulated among the public officials who made that decision. And I think that our public officials here and our economic development system is trusting, eager, or overwhelmed. And I'll get into this more, but Muncie is a community that is poor, that has lost jobs, that has lost population, that has lost the capacity to do government work because our budgets have shrunk. And the other systematic deficiency is the public participation process. There was never a public forum with accurate or comprehensive information that was held. We'll get into that a little bit more. And I'd just like to suggest that systemic problems are not fixed by blaming a party, a faction, or an individual. When I was presenting in front of City Council in June on a project of my own, and I remember Waelz coming in. It wasn't really of interest to me. I listened to their presentation, and I thought to myself, boy, that was slick. I hope someone's looking into that. And then I went on vacation for the summer, right? So, we all could have been at that meeting. I could have looked into it further. We all need to figure out how to systematically address this problem instead of assuming that we can just write off one group or person and claim it's their fault. Systematic solutions to problems require creating new institutions, right? They aren't solved by an election. They aren't solved by firing somebody. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about how we can address some of these systemic problems and create new institutions. And we have to keep our guard up, because Muncie is a target for what economic development planners or planners in general call low-road development. Right? As I mentioned before, about 30% of Muncie residents live in poverty. Our population is down 9.6% from 1980. State property tax caps reduced our county budget by 42%. Right? So we also have 52 other sites covering a total of 429 acres that are also old industrial sites that we would want to redevelop, that we would want to use in some way. And lead is a persistent problem in this community. More than 95% of homes in our urban core were built before 1960, before there was any regulation about lead paint. And the only EPA non-attainment area in Indiana is located in Muncie, right next to the Exide plant. And EPA non-attainment is a fancy way of saying they're way over their limits in terms of lead. And this low road of economic development, accepting polluting industries, providing subsidies for corporations that give bad jobs, wastes our positive efforts, right? We have spent money on redeveloping our downtown. We have beautiful parks, conservancies, and a river that I use on a weekly basis. As opposed to other post-industrial cities like Muncie, we're fortunate in that we have a university, a hospital, and the county seat. Those are all things that aren't going to leave. But if we continue to cite polluting and low-wage jobs in Muncie, the workers will just come from elsewhere. They won't live here. They won't contribute to our tax base. And, all right. So how do we stave off low-road economic development? What kind of things do we need to pay attention to? And then a little bit about how we create institutions to do that. So I would say that there are two main points that I want to convey to you. The first is don't get duped. Whatever the name of this place is, Heritage, WSP, they're an $8 billion corporation. The city budget of Muncie is about $42 million a year. They have many, many, many more resources to trick us than we have to I wouldn't actually say that's true. They have a lot of resources to try and trick us. And the other point the other thing that I'd like to suggest is that you need to enable ordinary residents to participate in development. Josh doesn't talk about this tonight, but his other role in this community is running Avondale United Methodist on the south side, and I go to supper with him on Thursday nights, and he is building community in that neighborhood that does planning, that does the work of redevelopment in that neighborhood at a very small scale. So we need to figure out ways to enable ordinary residents to participate in development. So if we wanted to improve governance, if we wanted to improve it systematically so that we don't get duped, one reasonable suggestion might be that environmental and health impact review occurs before voting on any subsidy or zoning variance. And again, I mean, like a month before. And these boards in the city, you could require that they have people with particular kinds of expertise on them. The Muncie Redevelopment Commission is not only dealing with economic development. The Muncie Redevelopment Commission is obviously dealing with issues that affect our health and our environment. Why not require that or that environment and health experts be on these boards? And as someone who's participated on boards, and I'm lucky enough to be a professor, I can put this on my tenure portfolio. You need to compensate people to do this work, right? You need to compensate people to do good work on boards, because honestly what happens with these things is everybody's doing 12 different things and nobody does their homework because they're not getting paid to do it. These are all voluntary boards. So compensate board participation. And then the one I really like to talk about is empowering ordinary residents. And this is kind of out of order. There we go. So I don't think it would be unreasonable to have public presentations in the neighborhoods that are going to be affected by particular site plans. Why not, instead of putting an announcement in the Star Press in as law requires, and then calling it a day and telling people to come to City Hall, why not go out to the places where we're proposing redevelopment? Why not make that a rule? These are all things that our city council, could do. Why not empower neighborhood planning boards to have development review authority? Why not allow them to determine whether a property reuse proposal is within their interest or not? And why not use our TIF money, the money that was going to be spent to entice this employer to come, on neighborhood-generated plans and projects? Through a variety of different planning processes, including the 812 Coalition, which Josh is a part of, and the Muncie Action Plan, we've created neighborhood associations, neighborhood councils, and I've been at their meetings, and they want to do stuff, but there aren't resources. You can apply for grants, but that takes some technical know-how. I guarantee you, if there was money on the table, more people would participate in local governance. More people would show up whenever it's time to talk about a proposed development. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. And I just want to reiterate my thanks to my fellow presenters here. And Josh said that for the, 40 people, 18 hours a day for the past 2 weeks? 3 weeks. So, I stand on the shoulder of giants here, and I appreciate the work that they've done.
Our next panelist is Dr. Robert Byrn. He's a pediatrician for IU Health Ball Memorial Physicians. He's a Muncie native. He's an advocate for the health of Muncie's children. He graduated valedictorian from Muncie Central High School in 1995. And he earned his undergraduate degree in chemistry from Wabash College. Following college, he attended Indiana University School of Medicine, followed by 3 years of pediatric specialty training at Riley Hospital for Children. Dr. Byrn and his wife, Kara, Kara is also a native of Muncie and a Muncie Central valedictorian. They have 3 children. He's going to talk about pollution and those effects on children, what we know and what we don't know as it relates to this facility in question.
Gosh, thanks for the wonderful introduction, Josh. I couldn't have written it any better myself. First, I just want to thank Josh. Man, you were on this early. You were vigilant. You brought it to our attention. Your leadership was amazing. So thank you, Josh. I want to thank the members of our local news media for keeping the issues front page, alerting us, educating us. I think you really proved the value of local news media to all of us. If you don't have a subscription to one of our local news institutions, please do so. And I want to thank all of you guys. Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for having a voice for our children. Thanks for speaking up for those who can't speak up for themselves. Josh gave kind of my background. So I'm a Muncie lifer. I grew up here. I was born at Ball Hospital in 1977. You know, growing up, a lot of my childhood friends' dads worked for factories. They had good jobs, good high-paying jobs. Those jobs fed their children, clothed them, contributed to our tax base to help build the parks that Dr. West just talked about. A little extra on the side for entertainment dollars. Maybe they'd go see a show at Civic. More likely they'd be at the Clancy Village Bowl on a Friday night. Help save for their child's education so they could grow up, become educated, move on, and help save for their retirement as well. So when it comes to economic development and weighing these decisions on whether to welcome a company into our town and how to support them from a tax base, I'm very sensitive to the fact that the economic development, that kind of provides the tools by which people build a better life here. And I'll say this, for as vocal of a critic as I've been for the Exide facility, which refuses to install the most robust, up-to-date pollution control devices, pollution control that's on factories just a few miles down the road in Indianapolis, for as vocal as a critic as I've been, the people that I've met who work there are some of the hardest working people I've ever met, and they're just trying to build a better life for their family. So as we think about this, I think in order to know how we move forward, how we make decisions based on what we do in a situation like we've just been through, we have to know what the trade-offs are. You know, as a brilliant economist, Thomas Sowell always likes to say, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. I looked at the parking lot when I came in. I think most of us drove here. So we're willing to incur some damage to our environment in order to live our everyday, daily lives. But unless we truly consider what the trade-offs are, we can't know how to make decisions in a situation like this. So as I started thinking about what you guys really want to know from me, I thought, well, I'm a pediatrician. You probably want to know how a facility like this might impact the health of our children. Fair to say? Lead is always one of the first things that I like to start off with because it's so well studied. The literature is so clear. As most of you probably know, lead exposure leads to lower IQs, increased rates of ADHD, lower birth weights. There's been a shift since I've been in practice in the 13 years in terms of the level that we even worry about lead. It used to be a level of 10 micrograms per deciliter. It's a level that we had when I started. We thought that was okay. And over the years, we've learned that even at much lower rates than that, lead can be permanently detrimental to children. To give you some perspective, going from a level of 1 microgram per deciliter to 10, where we used to think was okay, that costs 6.2 IQ points on average for a child. Think about that. For some, that's the difference between graduating from high school or maybe not graduating. For others, that might be the difference from being accepted to medical or law school and not. Looking through the data, I'm always alarmed. I'm always amazed at the literature when it comes to lead. This is one I always have to go back to and reread because I think it's wrong every time I see it. That as many as 1 in 5 cases of ADHD can be attributed to lead exposure. That's an amazing number. We have Republicans, Democrats, people of different political parties in here, and we always argue about how to decrease healthcare costs. And when you start thinking about a statistic like that, and you think about the increased cost of the medication for a child, the increased cost of the extra doctor's visits, let alone the increased cost of a child that has to repeat first grade because he couldn't pay attention in class, that's an astounding statistic. So we all should be alarmed about lead exposure. 23 million IQ points across the nation. That's what's lost as a result of lead exposure. It's egregious. Lead exposure is a risk factor for conduct disorder and criminal behavior. There was a really nice study that came out of California recently looking at exposures near the Vernon former Exide facility is now shut down. The batteries come here instead to be recycled. They looked at baby teeth in infants, and they found that children who were born to mothers living in areas with higher lead soil concentrations had higher amounts of lead in their baby teeth. That's an amazing study that shows mom's exposure to lead in soil impacts a child. As I looked at the research, study after study after fact-filled study shows that lead is just an egregious exposure and a danger to our kids. I'm going to leave mercury to the other experts. I think it speaks for itself. We know it's bad. There's been plenty of research to prove that. It's kind of one of those things that's not been as ubiquitous in our environment as lead has been because we recognize so early on that is bad. And I'm glad that this facility is not coming to town to be the highest airborne polluter of mercury in the nation. Suffice it to say that mercury is toxic to children and fetuses and shouldn't be present in the environment. I think that speaks for itself. One of the things that I was going to speak about is what we don't know about this factory. It's kind of a moot point now, but there's a lot of other interesting research going down the line of each of the toxicants that this was going to produce. One of the interesting ones was a particulate matter. And this is just kind of highlights the type of things we have to take into account as we're thinking about the health of children and how it affects their long-term development. So between ages of 11 and 15, children develop a great expansion in their lung capacity. So as they're going through their growth spurts, their lungs grow too, and that's how they develop the increase in their lung capacity. It's a permanent thing. A child that doesn't develop that increased capacity in their lungs will never go on to recover that later in life. And there was a great study out of California that showed over the course of 20 years, they measured several different areas, and they measured children's increased lung capacity, and they measured the pollution in those areas. And they very clearly linked improvement in children's lung capacity with decreasing concentrations of particulate matter. One of the things with the permit, and that I was going to ask the other experts, and now it's kind of a moot point, is the fact that the way this was permitted, it wasn't going to be really clear what the concentration of particulate matter at a given point in our city was going to be. So again, I'm glad that this isn't coming here. But suffice it to say that we have to think about the environment and our children, the lasting effects that our environment has on our children as they develop, and the fact that many of those effects are permanent and they can never recover from that. I was going to go through a long list of things. I was going to talk about how many IQ points do we have to lose to justify one additional job? How many miscarriages is a job worth? I don't know how to weigh that. That seems like a terrible thing to think about. How many additional criminal acts as a result of lead exposure does it take to justify 60 jobs, 100 jobs, 1,000 jobs? I don't know. How many asthma cases? How many adult years lost? How many childhood cancers? How do we make those decisions? The reality is, with the type of permitting this facility had, we would have no way to weigh that because it wasn't going to be clear on what the concentrations of a lot of those pollutants would be. But now I'll put it back to you, Muncie citizens. How many IQ points did you save through your advocacy? How many children did you help? How many first graders won't have to repeat first grade because they had attention problems and they couldn't pay attention? How many heartbroken parents did you save that didn't have to experience a miscarriage of their unborn child? How many children will now have a father because their dad wasn't incarcerated as a result of criminal acts from lead exposure? How many grandparents get to go to a wedding that they wouldn't have gone to because perhaps they would have had a premature death as a result of not developing that lung capacity as an adolescent? How many children don't have to go through cancer, can grow up, graduate school, fall in love, raise their children, hold their grandchild? So thank you, Muncie citizens. Please submit questions. Be happy to answer them at the end.
Our next speaker is Dr. Pichtel. He's researched environmental pollution and the management of hazardous materials for almost 40 years. He has been on the faculty of Ball State University for 32 years. His areas of specialization include contamination of the environment, management of hazardous waste, and emergency management. He has worked with incinerators and other high-temperature systems. He's written 3 books, 8 book chapters, and about 60 scientific papers, most relating to hazardous materials. Dr. Pichtel.
Thank you, Pastor. It is so great to see you all, and I have to echo the words of Dr. Rybarczyk. You people are amazing. Your efforts have been astounding. This is the way democracy is supposed to work, so thank you so much. Thank you. Now, much of my presentation was prepared before 2:45 today, before the announcement was made that Waelz was being thrown out of Dodge. There is still quite a bit of useful data that I want to share with you because even though this facility may be dead and buried in Muncie, there's always a possibility it could raise its ugly head in another nearby town. So we have to be equipped with information to share with fellow Hoosiers. A number of steps at the WSP facility I could go through. I just want to talk about a couple. The material that's being input to the plant and what happens during burning of this material. There are a number of hazards inherent in all of these. This is the general, whoa, excuse me. This is the general layout of the facility. So the material is received. EAF dust is very fine. Think of a floury material. It is mixed with water, it is conditioned, pressed into pellets, placed into the kiln, KILN. It is roasted, thermal processed, and various emissions are produced. Okay, the lighting is not good here, but this is a pile of EAF dust in another facility, EAF meaning electric arc furnace dust. That is the starting material for the Waelz process. Contains mostly zinc and iron oxides, but also, as you are aware now, possibility of contamination by mercury, by lead, barium, cadmium, whatever had occurred in that original steel feed. And all of these are toxic. I'm not going to go through these numbers, I don't think. Just a few items do bear mentioning, though. Dr. Byrn had mentioned particulate matter. okay? I want to emphasize, this is not harmless dust. This is not just carbonaceous dust, but this is whatever was in that kiln. It could be carbon, but also lead and mercury and heaven knows what else. It just so happens, too, there's a whole science of aerobiology. Particulates, we can measure their size, and we can track where they go. Very fine particulate matter can be drawn deep into the recesses of the lungs, and they will not be breathed out. Okay? They will pose a permanent hazard to those that bring them in. There's a hazard with asthma, with emphysema, with a number of other respiratory ailments from these particulates, but I want to emphasize, if they are coated with lead or mercury, that just worsens the hazard. And according to the permit application by the Waelz facility, WSP will take reasonable precautions to limit its fugitive dust emissions. That's a fairly general term, but I didn't define fugitive emissions, but just imagine a plant operating and the door is open and wind passes through and some compounds pass out of the plant. Those are fugitive emissions. Some of you may have seen this from an earlier article. This is the Waelz facility in Millport, Alabama, a mere 11 years ago. This is a Google Maps photo from this year. You'll notice the white roof is gone. Let me backtrack. Lovely white roof. Now this is quite coated with a grayish material. Is that fugitive emissions? It could very well be. We don't know for sure without analyzing them. Now, let us just suppose that this facility had been sited, in Muncie, okay? Fugitive emissions can travel upwards of hundreds of miles, especially the very fine particles. Those that I mentioned can go deep into the lungs. They could have been transported from this facility all the way out to Ohio. That was the site, the proposed site for Waelz. And the winds, most of the year, tend to migrate to the north and east. So most of Muncie would have been downwind from this site. Not to mention something called track out. What if there are these emissions on the ground at the facility? Trucks will move in and out. They can transport these emissions farther on the city streets. So that was the input material. I want to talk briefly about the roasting of this material in the kiln itself. This is what it looks like in Alabama, and this is really the workhorse of the whole facility. Many thousands of degrees Fahrenheit will roast those ores. This is a schematic diagram here. Now, in addition to that arc furnace dust, carbon is added. This could be anthracite coal or metallurgical coke. Okay, here's a statement from the Alabama Department of Environmental Management. As a result of kiln operations at the Millport facility, it is a major source of particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and volatile organic compound emissions. Some of these terms may be rather foreign to some of you, but all of these are hazardous to human health. Well, nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides are related to acid rain. Do you remember acid rain? Decades ago, a notorious problem in the U.S. These gases contribute to acid rain. Okay. I'm just looking at the permit application, page 218. Potential, HAP means hazardous air pollutant emissions. It was estimated 4.1 pounds of mercury per day, which works out to almost 1 ton per year. I don't know about you folks, but that scares the daylights out of me. Mercury is extremely toxic. Very briefly, I'll go through this. I'm going to be repeating a little of what Dr. Byrn had said, but first of all, no amount of mercury in the human body is safe. It can damage the developing fetus, and this is permanent damage. Mercury has an affinity for nervous tissue. It tends to absorb in the fat of the nervous system. So the central nervous system is damaged, as well as other parts of the body. Young children that are developing physiologically, they're much more vulnerable to mercury and to lead. A pregnant mother can pass mercury from her system into the unborn fetus. Also, mercury can be passed into to the young child through breast milk. And I've listed some of the effects on the fetus: brain damage, intellectual disability, loss of coordination. These are permanent. EPA says that some forms of mercury are carcinogenic, but the jury's out on that. I'm not so worried about cancer and mercury. I'm worried about nervous system damage. Likewise, lead damages the nervous system, but you name an organ system, lead will damage it. Once again, pregnant women are quite vulnerable to lead. It can result in miscarriages, premature births. Once again, children are more vulnerable to lead poisoning than adults. The last estimate that I've read is that 6% of Indiana children are legally lead poisoned. It doesn't mean that it's going to be fatal to them. It means that there is an excess quantity of lead in their blood, may resulting in permanent damage. This facility could potentially have released significantly more lead. We've got 3 different agencies that state that lead is a human carcinogen. Very important, and this is some of my bread and butter in my own research, these heavy metals do not go away. Once they've been deposited onto the soil, they stay put for centuries, for thousands of years. This is material that we could track into the house. And I've got just a few more minutes. I'd mentioned in the kiln, we add electric arc furnace dust. We also add some kind of carbonaceous fuel. And there was very little information about this carbonaceous fuel in the air permit application, but common fuels, anthracite coal, petroleum coke, very important, ladies and gentlemen. When burned, these types of carbon fuels give off a number of highly toxic compounds, okay? And these can't be captured by the filters on the Waelz facility. This will go out the stack. I don't know if anyone's heard of pyrene or benzopyrene. These and many other carcinogenic compounds could be emitted. Just skip that. Oh, speaking of particulates, a little bit ago, according to the permit, page 221, it's estimated 587 pounds of particulates being emitted out of the air pollution control device. If you're not familiar with the term baghouse, that is the air pollution control device that would be used at the Waelz facility. 600 pounds a day, almost 600 pounds a day would be emitted. That is a catastrophic figure. All right, did you happen to see this? Okay, Todd Donati. I knew that the Waelz facility would have to survive the rigorous requirements of the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. I have to believe that IDEM is more reliable than not. Well, that's good. And if the manufactured product is as bad as being portrayed, then they would deny their application for a permit. I'm glad I put this in print so you could all read along with me, but a number of our students go on to work with IDEM. I know many of them. They are hardworking, dedicated scientists. That's not the problem. There happens to be pressure, though, from above to hurry, number one, to hurry their inspections, but also we must remain friendly to industry. So there's intense economic and political pressure to maintain the industry-friendly status of Indiana. Yes, I just want to close with a statement that Mr. Morrison of the Waelz Company had made, that we have been excellent environmental stewards at our facility down in Alabama. I did some homework looking at the file cabinets, the electronic file cabinets in Alabama, and there are a number of so-called notices of violation of the Waelz facility there. Mismanagement of baghouse emissions, mismanagement of hazardous wastes. Here's one notice of violation, August 24th, 2017. January 2nd, 2018. This has to do with atmospheric emissions. Due to the seriousness of the violation, we'll consider issuance of an order with penalty. Okay, I mentioned this a moment ago. The commissioner of IDEM has directed that inspectors are to have, goodness, don't quote me on this, it might be 15 days to complete an investigation of a facility from the time that inspectors receive their job to work on this, study this facility, collect data, analyze the data, and write the report. However, the statutes say 45 days. Inspectors should have 45 days to review facilities. The commissioner says no, much, much less than that. Got to keep moving. Maybe I'll close with this, okay? Indiana is ranked 49th in terms of pollution, okay? We are one step above Louisiana. That's troubling to me, okay? Again, I want to repeat that even though the Waelz facility has been shot down in Muncie, it may still appear in another town in Indiana, so we do need to be on our guard. Everyone, thanks so much. Thank you. And I'll be happy to take questions also if you want to write them on the cards. Thanks again.
Thank you. I think myself and the crowd, we trust that you all are saving this information for accessibility later. Our last speaker is Dr. Indra Frank. Dr. Frank earned a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Pomona College and her MD from Johns Hopkins University. She did a residency in pathology and laboratory medicine at the University of Washington in Seattle, then served 4 years on active duty in the Medical Corps of the U.S. Air Force. Dr. Frank practiced pathology until 2004, when she shifted her career to environmental health. She earned a master's degree in public health from Indiana University and has since worked in environmental health programs, education, and policy. She currently serves as the Director of Environmental Health and Water Policy for our very own Hoosier Environmental Council. Dr. Frank.
Hi. Well, thank you all for coming out this evening. Amazing news this afternoon. Really amazing news. So, as Josh said, I work for the Hoosier Environmental Council. There we go. I know this thing comes loose. Somebody else got it loose. The Hoosier Environmental Council is a not-for-profit organization that's been working on Indiana environmental challenges since 1983. We're working to try to make Indiana sustainable, including having a sustainable economy, just like all of you did in the last couple of weeks. Congratulations. I prepared, since my field is environmental health, and I've done a lot of work over the last 15 years on lead emissions and mercury emissions and trying to prevent lead poisoning and prevent exposure to toxic pollutants. I prepared an 8-page summary that has to do with the various air emissions that the Waelz company had in their air permit application. It's not particularly relevant tonight, and you've already heard some of the main points, but we will have it up on our website. One of my colleagues prepared a web page for the Hoosier Environmental Council about the Waelz proposal. It's hecweb.org/Waelz. Waelz is Waelz. So again, the URL for the information that I assembled is hecweb.org/Waelz. And I think as the final speaker this evening, maybe what I could do is sum up. Muncie has a brownfield site called Borg Warner. It's a site that has an environmental restrictive covenant on it. That means there's a document attached to the deed for that land that says you can't use this land for this, this, and this. There's a list of things you can't use it for. You can't use it for residences, for example. It's too contaminated. So here came this proposal to actually put this piece of land back to work, right? The Waelz company was going to build a factory that would use that brownfield site. It would produce 90 or so jobs, right? That's what was in the newspaper. And not only that, it was going to take waste from steel mills and make a useful product out of it. What's not to love? It sounded really good. I don't fault the city council for taking an active interest in putting a brownfield to work, putting people to work, and recycling steel mill waste, right? Not only that, but the leaders of this Waelz company said that they were going to use, the latest pollution control devices and that there would be no emissions. Thank goodness their air permit application got into the hands of Dr. Rybarczyk. Yeah, definitely. And thank goodness he read all 238 pages of it. I wouldn't ask a city council to read 238 pages of an air permit application. It's outside of their expertise. The company should have presented accurate environmental information to begin with when they put the proposal forward. So they said there wouldn't be emissions. When you look at the air permit application, it lists their own estimates of what the emissions would actually have been, including the lead and the mercury that we've heard about. So more than 1,000 pounds of lead per year, on the order of 1,500 pounds of mercury per year. There would also be emissions of cadmium, carbon monoxide. You've heard of that because you're supposed to have a carbon monoxide monitor in your house. The particulate matter, which has an effect on the respiratory system and on cardiovascular system, volatile organic compounds, and sulfur and nitrogen oxides that contribute to ground level ozone. Ozone, when it's at ground level with all of us, triggers asthma attacks and other respiratory problems. So in their air permit, we've got this list of emissions. Many of those things, or most of them, have human health implications. And then third, we also know from previous industrial facilities all around the world that when you release materials like that into the environment, they wind up in the human body. It doesn't matter that you're not intentionally eating soil that got contaminated. You're not trying to ingest the dust that got loose as a fugitive emission from just years of one pollutant after another. We've accumulated in our environmental health literature astounding amounts of evidence that when you release toxic materials into the environment, you've lost control of where that toxic material is going to go. It winds up in human bodies. Lead, for example, once released from the Waelz smokestack, it wasn't going to stay in the air. Lead has a tendency actually to fall out within the first 2 or 3 miles. It depends how tall your smokestack is. It depends on the prevailing winds and what the local weather is. But generally speaking, where we have lead polluting industries, the soil downwind of those industries winds up contaminated with lead. And as our previous speakers have said, lead doesn't break down over time. Neither does mercury. These are forever pollutants. So now you've got lead contaminated soil, and next year the plant is going to emit another 1,000 pounds of mercury. And the next year it's going to emit another 1,000 pounds. And there's good data in the public health literature documenting that children who live in an area where there's lead contaminated soil have a much higher risk of lead poisoning And lead poisoning, as Dr. Byrn very eloquently said, means lower IQ and an increased risk of behavioral problems, including an increased risk of criminal behavior in the teenage and young adult years. So that's lead. We've heard about mercury. One of the pollutants that my colleagues here haven't mentioned are the dioxins and furans. This was also not mentioned in the Waelz permit application. But if you look at other Waelz facilities around the world, they do emit dioxins and furans. In fact, there's a substantial literature about how to try to control the dioxins and furans that are coming out of Waelz facilities. And you want to control them because these are compounds that are highly carcinogenic. They also are endocrine disruptors. They can interfere with the immune system or with the reproductive system. They are formed during that combustion process, that heat process in the kilns. And there's, like I said, a lot of literature on how to control the dioxins and furans from Waelz plants. But those techniques were not written up into this Waelz permit application. They said nothing about having dioxin emissions and nothing about any intention of controlling them. That was another part. And then, of course, this facility would also have greenhouse gas emissions, which doesn't have a direct effect on everyone's health here in Muncie, but it contributes to climate change, which impacts all of our health with increased risks of heat-related illnesses like heat stroke, increased flooding events, and increased extreme storms. And, you know, no one at this point, I think most of us don't want to add to our community's climate change or, you know, greenhouse gas emissions. So the facility has been turned down, or has the proposal to build it here in Muncie has been withdrawn as of this afternoon. I'm very, very glad that you all decided to gather here tonight anyway, and that Josh proceeded with the information session, because the information, once gathered together, will be much harder for another community to have to go through this. My organization works statewide on environmental issues, and I will be watching to see whether this proposal shows up elsewhere in Indiana. If it shows up elsewhere outside Indiana, perhaps we'll be able to pass this information to the next community. If they were going to control all of their pollutants, you know, maybe this wouldn't have been such a bad thing, but they weren't. So thank you all for coming out tonight. If you are interested in kind of keeping tabs on Indiana environmental issues on a regular basis, we do send out an email newsletter, and I brought a sign-up sheet with me if anyone wanted to sign up for the newsletter. And each year we put on a conference on the current Indiana environmental issues, and I left slips about that conference at the front table. It's coming up in November. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Some questions have been sent down, and so we'll take a few minutes to go through those. First of all, thank you all. This card says, "I very much appreciate all your efforts on behalf of my family." Okay. For each of the speakers that have this information on like a PowerPoint, are folks going to be given access to those PowerPoints so that they may share with those who could not attend?
I'll be happy to share mine. I can send them to you.
Okay, that sounds fine. Yep, sounds fine. Yes. Pardon?
As long as they ignore typos.
Yeah, so ignore typos. Yeah. And remember this is ongoing collection, correct? Updated as we go on. Okay. Can someone put Dr. Frank's web address onto the community involvement page? And that was, once again?
Sure, yeah. HECWEB.org/Waelz. So WAELZ. Yeah.
Thank you. Can anyone answer this question? Which city council members voted for the TIF award for Waelz, and which ones voted against?
My understanding is they voted unanimously for it.
That's correct.
And I would just sort of like that to take that as a jumping off point, that across the board, regardless of party, they all made the same error. And so that points to a systematic issue. And you all are gathered here right now. Now is the time to ask for reform so that we can't have all of our city council members being ill-informed and mistaken about a development process. We need to keep this energy moving forward. It's not the mistake of one person, it's a system problem.
And is it accurate for me to say, Dr. West, that in many instances, in your opinion, those types of situations are best addressed with new creations rather than trying to single out little odd or erroneous things in the existing? Actually, what I'm asking is the slide that you mentioned about creating new institutions.
Well, a city ordinance is an institution. Right, a city ordinance that requires certain kinds of information to be divulged prior to voting for subsidy or zoning change. That would be an institution. So institutions are often built on top of other institutions. I wouldn't say it has to be wholly new. I would say that there's a lot of opportunity for creating systems that don't lead to this kind of failure again.
Thanks for that clarification. There is a question here, where is the mayor tonight? And I asked that question, I'm reading that, and it was passed up and sorted and curated. And I can tell you simply the conversation I had with him was that he and his wife are out of town. How did our leaders get bamboozled into believing zero emissions? Dr. Pichtel.
I don't have a good answer for you, although I must echo the words of Dr. West that individuals that are making political decisions for the good of the community must have some kind of science background themselves, or else speak with individuals, have people on the board that have a strong science background. Please.
Once the air permit application information started to get out, I saw quotes from some of the city leaders that they would depend on the Indiana Department of Environmental Management to be careful about the environmental effects. And there's a good and a bad. It's true, there are a lot of really good people working at IDEM and doing all that they can, but they are under constraints. With our current legislature and our current governor, our Department of Environmental Management is restricted to doing only what is absolutely required by federal law and no more. In fact, our legislature passed a law just a couple of years ago stating that Indiana would not have any laws that were stricter than the federal environmental laws. So we would not have any environmental laws stricter than the federal ones without jumping through additional hoops. So basically saying we are not going to individualize our own environmental regulations to our own situation. They kind of gave away that power. So IDEM will only do exactly what they have to under the Clean Air Act. The Federal Clean Air Act has done a lot of good for this country. It's because of the Federal Clean Air Act that Waelz had to write an air permit application, right? So if we hadn't had the Clean Air Act, we never would have seen that air permit application in the first place, and that's what brought us to tonight. So thank goodness we have the Clean Air Act at the federal level. Unfortunately, it has its limitations. One of those limitations is lead. It's not as strong as it needs to be to really protect public health on lead emissions. We saw that a few years ago with Exide when their air permit application was up for renewal. My organization, Hoosier Environmental Council, and a number of others got together and requested additional pollution controls, and that request was denied because it went beyond what would be required under the Clean Air Act. So yes, IDEM's doing what it can, but there are limits on what it can do.
So it's possible that the state legislature could redraft and approve a different law that would allow us to be stricter than the EPA or federal court. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Dr. Rybarczyk, which council member asked you to review the permit?
It was not a council member. I was never approached by any council members. This was a Muncie official that I just received a phone call and asked me what I thought of this and just asked me to review it. I had a personal connection with the individual. I used to be on the emergency management team here in Delaware County. You probably didn't know that. I was the technical consultant for many years when Bill Gosnell was the head of that organization. And I responded, some of you may remember when the anthrax scares happened with the white powder and when the mercury spills. Again, I've had a lot of experience with mercury. Remember when people spilled mercury in the Kennedy Library? I was part of the cleanup on that in one of the houses on Godman Street and so on. And because I had worked with this individual, I was contacted and they said, well, we want to know your opinion of what you think of this. And I told them to run as far and fast as they could away from it because of all the dangers and the things I saw with it at the time. But the city council never approached or asked even for any help on this. And that's one of the things we have to break down. I'll keep hearing about STEM and all the education we're giving our children in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Ball State is building 2 new STEM buildings. They just completed the one, and we're going to get the new chemistry building and so on. But people are so skittish about science. When I'm introduced at a party, I tell them I'm a chemist, and most people's reaction are, ooh, I hated chemistry when I took it. We have to break that down. We have to make it so you can understand this. I just talked to another official not too long ago, and they said this is too complex. And I said, you can learn, and you can be educated, and you can understand in 15 to 20 minutes this whole project and what's involved in it. It's not too complex if you ask for the assistance to learn. And that's what we need to break down. I mentioned it earlier. It's scientific innocence. It's scientific ignorance. Don't be ignorant. Ask questions. This city official contacted me and said, hey, I need your opinion. City council could have done the same thing. All of them could have picked up the phone. They chose not to for whatever reason. And this was a done deal. And this went up through many different levels, and we all know that. Let's break that down. Don't be afraid to ask for science. I told my student this morning, try to explain pH to somebody that doesn't understand pH. It's a very hard thing to do, but it can be done. You can educate just with a little bit of knowledge that's been expressed tonight. Share that with people and go out there and show them how they can understand science. Don't be afraid of it. That's the thing we have to break down here. And people making $15 million decisions, I would have thought, would have found out that something this technical, this is a chemical refinery. And I don't know if you all realize that. They took in hazardous waste and they shipped out hazardous waste and just made it more concentrated. One of the people were talking about, I think Dr. Frank was talking about the dioxins that were present. That's TCDD. It's one of the most toxic substances in the world. And that it was the main component that most of you would relate to or be familiar with in Agent Orange in Vietnam. That was going to be emitted from the site. It was brought in the EAF dust. it was shipped out in the EAF dust and in the air emissions. And none of this was addressed. We would have been breathing Agent Orange in this community. And that was never addressed in the permit. Again, in the permits, they were never allowed, or they were never going to analyze the material coming in. The EAF dust was primarily coming from recycled automobiles. They were taking cars and they were going ahead and reusing, recycling the scrap steel. And these were the byproducts. So whatever was in the cars that they produced this dust, that's what would come into this plant. But they never had to analyze it as it came in, and so we don't even know what the emissions would have been coming out. This was all modeled, this was all projected. What comes in goes out. Well, one of these facilities got some contaminated material that they bought, never had to analyze it, never did it. It contained radioactive cesium. And they went and sold it back as hazardous waste, and they released radioactive cesium in the air. How would you like to breathe radioactive cesium? That's what was coming in. They were not accountable for what came in or what came out. So ask questions. This isn't hard. This isn't brain surgery. This technology goes back to 1910. And they were going to do nothing different, even though they claimed it was state of the art. So I will shut up.
Dr. Frank, without strict environmental regulations, what is to prevent farmers from selling their private property to large corporations that can pollute like this? I think the question is regarding what if they went elsewhere into vast farm areas to do this?
So it is possible that this Waelz proposal will show up someplace else. Apparently there's a lot of this dust that needs processing. My hope would be that they write a better permit and they include better pollution controls and they do a better job of public engagement the next time around. Right now, there are a number of regulations that one would have to go through to bring this Waelz proposal someplace else. It would depend on that local county's zoning to begin with. They would have to resubmit their air permit. They might need a water permit too. The facility in Alabama also has a water discharge permit. And then we'll go through this again.
I know that this was billed at 8:30, so if you have to leave, please know that you won't be distracting anyone, but I feel like these questions need to be asked and responded to. Dr. Pichtel, are there good examples for how to rehabilitate, repurpose, use brownfield sites? What kind of business is appropriate for a brownfield site?
All right. There are hundreds of thousands of brownfield sites in the United States, depending on what source you read. Some are just mildly contaminated. Actually, some brownfields are not contaminated at all. Others may be slightly contaminated. Others are highly toxic, and they may go on to what's called the Superfund list. Some of you may have heard of the Superfund. These are the most contaminated sites in the United States. There are about 1,400 of those. But depending on the type of contamination, we might be able to use natural processes. In my laboratory, I've been studying bacteria for the breakdown of diesel fuel and jet fuel and gasoline. There might need to be more sophisticated technologies, injecting certain chemicals into the soil to break down these toxins. Unfortunately, some of these technologies are rather costly, and there are some local and federal agencies who would just prefer to cap over the site. Let's just attempt to prevent migration of this contaminant by paving over the surface. I'm not sure. What we could put on top is a thick layer of compacted clay. This could be several feet, which are run over with a backhoe. It could be asphalt. It could be cement. Problem is that these contaminants don't go away. When we're talking about metallic contaminants, lead, mercury, cadmium, and so forth, they will be there forever. There are other contaminants, though, like heating oil, gasoline, and so forth, which can slowly decompose over time. Some of it comes down to what the future use for the site is going to be. And also, is there a public health emergency? Is the site posing a threat to nearby drinking water wells, for example? Then we better involve some very sophisticated, very far-reaching technologies to clean it up. If it's not a public health emergency, we can use less costly technologies. I hope I answered.
Yes, thank you. Have you heard of any interest from universities in MAC schools, since they are primarily in post-industrial Midwest cities, at developing business models and research to remediate these types of sites, because the MAC schools live in those areas like Toledo, Bowling Green, Akron?
I can't speak specifically for MAC schools and students matriculating there. However, there have been a number of students graduating from our program that have gone on to create business models and environmental consulting firms that have been extremely successful because they put together not only the business aspect of it, but also the science aspect of it. And it makes to be a real potent combination of expertise, and it makes for very effective environmental cleanup.
Thank you. Dr. Byrn, how can we fight against Exide? Would you say the Exide emissions are a major concern for the everyday Muncie citizen? Alongside what can be done at present with the Exide plant already in Muncie?
I'm going to let Dr. Frank speak a little bit about this too, because I think you probably have better expertise on the wet electrostatic precipitator and the type of pollution controls that could go on there. My view on Exide, again, is the people that work there work extremely hard. They make, my understanding is, really good money to support their families. I understand the importance of jobs in our communities. But my view is on a lead processing facility that it must be done with the most state-of-the-art, best pollution control that's available. My challenge is I continue to see patients in the office with elevated lead levels, and lead is very ubiquitous in our environment. It can come from a lot of different areas, comes from the paint in old houses and sometimes the water supply. But there still seems to be a linkage to me between children who have elevated lead levels and a parent or family member that work in the facility. I don't have intricate working knowledge of exactly the controls they have there. I've been told that since the news came out a couple years ago that they've instituted some additional things, some scrubbing of the parking lot, some increased vigilance with their negative pressure control systems and such. But I think the factory is built at a time when we didn't understand as well as we understand now the dangers of lead, when our thresholds for concern were different than they are now. And so the question is, does the Exide facility pose a risk for the everyday Muncie citizen? Was that the...
What can be done since it's already here?
Yeah, so, the analogy to the other Exide facilities are the longer it's here, the more lead it puts off into the environment, the bigger of a problem that it becomes as that lead settles into the soil around the facility. I think in order to truly know the dangers to our children, we would have to have more extensive testing of the soil around the facility. So I think that would be number one, more extensive testing of the soil near the facility. I think number two, continued public pressure to install the types of pollution control systems that are in place at other battery recycling facilities. I'm going to hand this off to my colleagues that may understand those type of pollution controls better than I do.
Do you work on air controls? So there are some lead smelters that have installed an additional pollution control device called a wet electrostatic precipitator, and that was what we asked for back in 2015 at Exide. It was turned down because that would have gone beyond what the Clean Air Act requires. That device would at least cut their current emissions in half from what I understand. Although I should say they made corrections so there was an EPA action against Exide in about 2013 or so. They made corrections after that, including putting the scrubber to work, that reduced their emissions substantially after about 2013. But it's true that there's an additional device that would reduce them even further.
In that same trajectory, is there anything, or how would we go about doing the work of removing Exide from our community?
I don't need the mic. Do what we did here.
Well, I was just going to say that, what we've done here, I think, is really important, because that is to say it's much easier to prevent a situation such as this than it is to change it once it's there. If you want to look at again, a really catastrophe that evolved over the course of decades, do a little web reading on the Vernon, California Exide facility. And it's kind of one of those things, once it's here, it's really hard to change, which is why I think, the importance of what we've done with the Waelz facility is vital.
Dr. West, can economic development funds be used to get grocery stores in food deserts? Can we work to encourage I&M to put solar fields on Muncie brownfields?
What are TIF?
Oh, what are TIF? Tax increment financing, which is a source of tax revenue that comes from the growth of property tax receipts in a particular district. Tax increment financing is one of the major tools that the City of Muncie uses for economic development purposes, because again, the City of Muncie has lost a tremendous amount of its general fund revenue, and so this is an accessible kind of money that the city can use. And the question was,
Can those be used for, why, I think people are asking, why can't those be used for the businesses we do, or the endeavors that we have that aren't like this attractional type thing, but they're, increasing the employment of 3% at 75 businesses in town or something.
there's no reason that they can't be used for those purposes. And in other communities, they are used for those purposes. And I just want to circle back to the question about other research at MAC universities. There's not one that's specific to MAC universities, but there's something called the Center for Community Progress that works on the issue of post-industrial cities and how to revitalize them. There's an author named Alan Malik who's written extensively on this topic. And it's very difficult work. The problems that Muncie faces, including the problem of environmental pollution, isn't a local problem. These are products that are coming from all over the world. Our jobs went all over the world. These are difficult problems to address. On the other hand, every single semester in the College of Architecture and Planning, we have multiple studio classes where students propose redevelopment of brownfield sites. My colleague Sang Lim Yu, for the past 5 years, has given different scenarios for developing solar facilities on brownfield sites. The state of Indiana doesn't reimburse local energy production in the way that other states do, so it's less economically viable. But there are a myriad of ideas out there, and they certainly don't have to be generated by $8 billion corporations. Everybody in this room can learn enough about brownfields to think about productive reuses. And so I guess I would just leave it there.
I apologize, I wasn't on the mic. That follow-up question to Dr. West was, can those types of funds be used? This is a theoretical scenario. Take 75 local businesses and somehow come up with a program that they would each increase their employment by 3% or 4% or something like that. And those types of scenarios, he said, there's nothing that prohibits that.
One of the points of my talk was that you need a combination of good ideas from local residents and expertise. So you can propose a lot of different kind of ideas about how to increase employment, but I would, talk to some of our professionals and faculty members about what the best way to do that is. That doesn't mean that the knowledge that you all have about redeveloping brownfields is illegitimate. It just means that we need to find ways of combining the fantastic expertise of our university and our local residents to come up with viable ideas. Adding three jobs to 75 different corporations, I don't exactly know how you would do that, but you could come up with, we need to work together.
That was just a sort of representative theoretical type scenario. How does an ordinary person start a neighborhood planning board alongside, Dr. West, is there a need for a civic task force for these types of things?
So the Muncie Action Plan has been putting together neighborhood associations for, I think it was founded in 2012. They don't have any regulatory power. And in order for them to have funding and regulatory power, they would have to be given that by some other public entity, the county, the city, the state. So yes, you can organize your neighbors. You can create a neighborhood association, but it would require some formal mechanism to give it more teeth than it can have just through volunteer efforts.
Two more. This is for everyone. Is there any data on health of the population of Millport, Alabama, where there is another thing that was proposed here? Any health data? Okay, we're on. Yes, sir.
That was going to be one of my questions that I was going to ask Mr. Williamson about. I have researched it some, and they should have documentation on their workers primarily, all the people that had to wear the respiratory equipment, the personal protection equipment, and so on, and then the surrounding area. One of the problems with that is, and again, I don't know how familiar anybody is, these other 4 facilities that they were always referencing are always in isolated, almost desolate places. There's one in South Korea on the coast. There's one in Turkey on the coast that is totally desert, and nobody lives around those areas. So there's not neighborhoods or a major urban area like we have here. The one in Millport, Alabama, was originally supposed to be in Mississippi, and we talked about the poverty levels and where Indiana stands on pollution. About the only places worse than Indiana are the Deep South: Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, and so on. And so the original place that Alabama site was supposed to be was in Mississippi, just on the Mississippi side of the border with Alabama. They tend to site these things near state lines or county lines so that the one facility that's put in pollutes the next county or the next state over. That's one of the tactics that are used. And so it was originally supposed to go in there, but they had problems with the permitting agency in Columbus, Mississippi. So then they moved to Millport, Alabama. Millport, Alabama is a really tiny town of about 1,100 people, so there's not a real big database or ways to look and find the medical documentation from there. They put the facility on the east side, so it was downwind of the town, so they wouldn't pollute the small town. And it is in a very heavily forested area due west of Birmingham, Alabama, which are the steel mills that supply that with the source. And so there isn't a lot of documentation. Mr. Williams Williamson should have documentation, though, on their workers, and that information is very difficult to get to. Now, I will read something to you. I promised to share with you about the facility, and this will be the first time this is probably heard. If you get on the Indeed website and look up Millport, Alabama, I will give you the comments that the employees said about working for this facility. And some of this is pretty striking. And all you heard about was how safe this facility would be and so on. This is what the workers had to say. And how very well organized this particular company was. I had several issues with the management and the safety programs. Safety program is a joke. This is coming out of Millport, Alabama. The turnover rates of the employees was very high. Management is a joke. There is little to no accountability. That one of the cons of the facility was pitiful management. The next one was management didn't know which way to look from one second to the next. Too many drunken leaders and not enough workers. There's a lot of micromanaging. This was from the laundry person there. Again, I don't know if you knew this. Before the employees could leave, they had to strip off all their clothes and take a shower. And the personal protective equipment they were going to throw into the kiln and burn. Okay? And this was the comment from a janitorial worker, because they had to do the laundry because the clothes have dust on them and can't leave the plant. The employees have to shower before leaving the plant. And then a pit cone operator said the con was no hazard pay. And remember, Mr. Williamson said no emissions and that this was safe. So why do they need hazard pay? Think about that for a while.
Thank you. Last one. We know that these things are dangerous. Is there any location that these things can take place, or can you bond these hazardous materials with something? And okay, so how do we deal with them? I mean, where's the loop? How do you finish the loop? It's okay.
Right, so it seems like there's always trade-offs, right? I mean, this facility was going to take waste from steel mills, and instead of that waste going to a hazardous waste landfill, they were going to make a useful product out of it. That sounds good until you start looking at all the hazardous emissions that were going to come out of here and the extraordinary greenhouse gas emissions. So there are trade-offs. With this particular facility, the way it was proposed here in Muncie, I felt like we would be better off just sending that steel mill waste to a hazardous waste landfill. That was the conclusion I came to.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. Would you please give your thanks to those who spoke up? Absolutely, absolutely. I want you to know that these folks spoke when it was not yet cool to speak about this, and we thank you for that. Just a couple last things on the screen. If you want to receive further updates regarding all things WSP or heritage or items that are about our community involvement, you can, I think it has to heat up.
I thought there was something.
Oh, there it goes. It's 765-273-3439. You can text your email to that number, and then you will be migrated to receiving updates. And we certainly won't waste your time or your space with those updates. Dr. Frank's webpage of her talk is going to be up. And I'd also like to ask, if you have been working on this for the last 3 weeks diligently, and you're still here because you're not passed out from exhaustion, would you stand up? Yes, stand up. I know who you are, but I'm seeing your faces for the first time. Lastly, I feel like that this, we've come to, as soon as the property is bought back and it's paid for and we part ways, that it's like, I almost feel like we've won a World Series, you know? But after the World Series, you start preparing for the next season. And that's exactly where we are now. And so I want to invite and encourage you to get some rest. Many of you have had trouble sleeping because of this. You can go to sleep tonight. And then we will be diligent to pick up making Delaware County, Muncie, our community, the type of community that we want. Sound good? Right now, starting at the farm stand and wrapping around the corner to up and down Walnut Street, we're just having a celebration. Just have a party. Yeah, that's right. So I hope to see you somewhere moving around. You are welcome to break into a couple songs. That would be all right as well. But see you on Walnut Street.